I'm Cathryn Cluver, the Executive Director of the Future Diplomacy Project, and I'm here with Alec Ross, the Senior Innovation Advisor to Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State. And this is our second podcast with Alec, who's been incredibly generous with his time to the project. And so I want to just welcome you back to campus.
Thank you. It's good
Alec.
to be back here.
So last year, when we had some time to sit together, we talked a lot about the general concept of 21st century statecraft. And now this is the second to last day of the first month of 21st century statecraft within the State Department. We've seen Victoria Nuland, the Speaker of the Department, take questions from Twitter from all over the world. You fielded questions from journalists and bloggers from all over the world. Talk a little bit about why now? What were you trying to do with this month? What were you trying to showcase? What were sort of the internal and external objectives of having this initiative?
Sure. So during the first 2 years of Hillary Clinton being Secretary of State, when we were developing our innovation agenda, what she calls 21st century statecraft, we were very much focused on developing projects, whether it is to fight the cartels in northern Mexico, whether it is to integrate social media within the communications practices of ambassadors, whether it's to figure out how to integrate ourselves in a productive way in the Maghreb. It was very project-based, and everything we were doing for the first time. Where we are now is we're very focused on institutionalization, taking some of the neat stuff that we did that was high impact, and rather than having them be one-off innovations or programs, really weave it into the formal practice of diplomacy at the State Department. So in January, we've dubbed it 21st Century Statecraft Month, really as simply as a way of putting a tag over something to organize our activities around the globe for the month. And the purpose of this was really to have a month-long campaign where we would push out and demonstrate our acceptance and use of these tools pretty broadly. So beyond just having the so-called digital diplomats using these tools, we had our head of policy planning, Jake Sullivan. We had our head of policy planning, Jake Sullivan, do a sort of virtual press conference with journalists from dozens of countries. We had our spokeswoman, Victoria Nuland, as you mentioned, doing what is typically the most traditional thing within foreign policy communications, standing behind the podium, doing so, but taking questions from Twitter. So it's really just a demonstration of how we're institutionalizing these practices.
And, I mean, now, can you talk about how it's worked if we still have 2 days to go, day and a half to go?
Well, it's worked well this month. I care less about this month in 21st Century Statecraft Month than I care about adapting our statecraft generally, so that for the years in the future we are not behind the rest of the world's citizens in terms of their sophistication about how to operate within these information networks. We're making progress. We are focused on everything from reforming the Foreign Service exam to training every diplomat, from the A100s to the ambassadorial seminar, making sure that every diplomat, they don't have to become social media experts, but they have to understand the impact of connection technologies within the context of our foreign policy. And so we're really focused on figuring out how we can weave these practices and these understandings into our diplomatic corps.
So that sort of gets to my second question, the internal and external pressures that may have sped up this process of internal change. So when we sat together in December of last year, we were only a few weeks from a Tunisian street vendor setting himself alight in Sidi Bouzid, prompting, again, not maybe the first street vendor to set himself alight, but sufficiently so that then you saw what happened across the Arab region. And there's been now, a pretty heated intellectual debate, political debate about the role of social media within that, the role of American-led and funded organizations of civil society using various tools to continue to, quote-unquote, fan the flames of change across the Arab Peninsula. So let me take a step back and ask you from your vantage point now that we're a year later. You've seen elections in Egypt. How important was social media within that framework? How ready was the State Department to use those tools when it happened? And sort of what's the assessment, 9 or 10 months after the fact?
So those are three big questions. I'll go one by one. So first, I think that it's important to not call these things Twitter revolutions or Facebook revolutions, as some do. That said, I think it's clear that technology, connection technologies, and social media specifically did four things within the revolutions. Number one, they accelerated movement making. So movements that historically would have taken years to become mass movements were built over the course of weeks because of the ubiquity and power of the information networks. Number two, it helped make weak ties between people stronger for the purposes of exercising dissent. Third, it enriched information environments. So places that used to operate in an environment of information scarcity were suddenly in an environment of information abundance. Though I should say that in this case social media worked, it's important to say, in tandem with pan-Arab satellite television to really enrich the information environment. And then fourth, it led it to what I would call relative leaderlessness. And so if you think, for example, about the movement in South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, one thing that happened was the development of institutions like the ANC and leaders like Nelson Mandela. If you think about the democracy movements in the 1970s and 80s, behind the Iron Curtain, you had the development of institutions like Solidarity and of leaders like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel. The accelerated nature of these movements mean that the institutions and the leaders within those institutions did not develop. So technology and social media were of enormous consequence in these revolutions, but they haven't necessarily been entirely positive. They were effective in helping to bring down the leaders of various countries, but it remains to be seen the degree to which they can be used productively to help build new governments. To the degree to which the State Department was prepared, well, that presumes that the State Department is a monolith, and it's not. We are 60,000 people distributed over 194 countries. What I will say is that Hillary Clinton was prepared. So there is a very technology savvy, social media savvy segment of her team that I think gave her good advice. She understood what was happening, and frankly, she understood what was happening well in advance of the Arab Spring. If you look at the Internet Freedom Agenda that she launched fully a year before Mohammed Bouazizi self-immolated in Sidi Bouzid, boy, she looked smart in retrospect. She was remarkably prescient. Now, that's not to say that all 60,000 diplomats got it. They didn't. In point of fact, there was a strong counter-narrative from so-called cyber skeptics, who I think are now probably embarrassed by much of what they published during this period. And so what we're now focused on is making sure that all of our diplomats are equipped with the information to be able to more effectively evaluate their information environments, to understand how to adapt statecraft in the face of the changing nature of these information environments. And so it's been disruptive, but I think we've done a pretty good job at the State Department, not just keeping up, but helping to lead in this space.
Okay, well that leads me to sort of three questions that come off of that specific answer. So at the Future Diplomacy Project, we look at things that we can try to read now for the immediate and near future. One thing is, of course, that looking at the Arab Peninsula, we knew there was this huge youth bulge already. Connecting those sort of things up with the point that you just made about, was there this going on at the State Department where you were looking at the demographic development across the Arab Peninsula, and then the usage of mobile phone technology, simple things from, where are the towers to keep connectivity alive, that kind of thing, cell phone towers. Were you kind of looking at that at all from a strategic vantage point, to where parts of the State Department could see this coming, or how did you bring those pieces together? Certain things we arguably could have known, and yet it seemed to take the world by surprise in its in its sort of vehemence, its spread, its breadth.
Yeah, look, in April of 2009, I predicted that within 3 years there would be a leaderless revolution. And, a lot of eyes rolled from very powerful senior members of America's foreign policy. And that proved true. I think that there were a great many other leaders, not the least of which was Hillary Clinton and people like Anne-Marie Slaughter and others, who did see this coming. And I think that we were equipped to give good advice shortly after the flame of the Arab Spring was lit. So, for example, of the 195 countries on planet Earth, the United States was first, number one, in identifying and condemning the actions of the Ben Ali government cyber attacking its citizens when it cyber attacked Facebook to try to understand the dissent movement newly taking root there. This was not the stuff of A1 New York Times articles at the time, but I think it showed the sophistication that we brought to the analytics. I think it showed the commitment we had to the policies of internet freedom and breaking with an ally, in this case the Ben Ali government, a month later the Mubarak government, but breaking with an ally on an issue like this and tethering it to the broader relationship, I think, is of some significance. Now, again, to back up, does that mean that 60,000 people in 195 countries who work at the State Department got it and were, hyper-programmed to both anticipate and respond to the unrest that took place? Absolutely not. That would be naive. Institutional change takes place over a very long time. And so, one of the questions you asked went to the question of, did you identify cell towers and such things, to be able to, for example, I assume provide redundant bandwidth if the internet gets shut down in a country or something like this. No. In Egypt, after the Mubarak government shut down the networks there, we didn't have a granular understanding of the makeup of the Egyptian networks, but we had it within a couple hours after they shut it down. So we do have relationships with the most sophisticated network engineers and operators in the world who can give us information quickly if we need it. I do think that this is going to be a years-long process. If you think about diplomacy and the formal conduct of statecraft is something that it has not been unchanged over the preceding decades and centuries, but it was more consistent than most professions. And I think that the practice of diplomacy, like so many other practices, is going to be significantly disrupted by our living in a world that's increasingly connected. And first and foremost, I think the whole notion of who your interlocutor is going to change. So traditionally, an ambassador in country X would have just met with the government ministers, the generals, and the CEOs. If you do that today, then you may have no idea what's going on in your country.
So this is a perfect segue into the getting back to the internet freedom piece. And I think what we're seeing now is that people have to become much smarter consumers of information that's coming at them and to them. So while people said, people were saying about particularly the pictures and tweets and images and Facebook lines that we were getting from Tahrir Square, it's like watching an amazing reality show. At the same time, you have these reports of sort of Russian brigades that are spreading on the internet freedom, messages that support the government. We've had those same sort of stories coming out of Syria, regime-friendly, quote-unquote, forces going in and spreading specific messages. You've said in the past that you think that people are too smart or smarter now and can very easily read between the lines and decipher what propaganda is in social media. Can they really? If we're throwing open the floodgates and the doors and everyone's a player, that makes that field wider and more difficult to navigate. So what's the...
Yeah, so, the traditional form of sort of government propaganda just does not work. And you mentioned Syria. It's a perfect example. So Rob Ford, our very capable ambassador to Syria, because of the relatively closed media environment that is Syria, the way in which he began communicating with the Syrian people was through blogging on Facebook. And what then happened is the Syrian Electronic Army would do a tactic that we call flooding the zone, where literally hundreds of whether they're individual people or identities or what, there would be hundreds of responses that would essentially say, "We love Bashar. You're undermining our sovereignty. Go back to the USA." And our response to that was important. Do we sort of curl into the fetal position and say, "Oh, well, this Facebook thing didn't work," or do we continue to publish there? And what's interesting is Ambassador Ford sort of withstood it. And what's interesting is that in very short order, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of real Syrians began pushing back and began outing the Syrian Electronic Army. And so what's fascinating is, Ambassador Ford would publish something, and every time he published something, you'd get like 1,500 responses. And the Syrian Electronic Army would mount an offense, but then so too would the Syrian citizens. And it actually ended up like pie in the face of the Syrian Electronic Army, because what I think they thought they were going to do is essentially push us off the networks by flooding the zone with propaganda, and it just doesn't work. People are very sophisticated consumers of information today, more so than a decade ago, more so than 2 decades ago. And to the extent that people try to obfuscate, to the extent that people try to lie and manipulate on these networks, it gets called out. Another example from Syria is somebody created a false identity for, I think it was a lesbian blogger or something like that, who, created an identity, tweeted or posted about an arrest and such thing. But what's a good thing is that the media themselves now has had to become so sophisticated about curating social media spaces that before they splashed this, this very provocative story on the front page of the Washington Post, they did real due diligence. And because of the large number of people on these networks, it didn't take long to figure out that this was a hoax. So hoaxes are far more easily spotted now than was the case when we were in an environment of information scarcity as opposed to information abundance.
So this gets me to this point about net neutrality, and I don't mean it in the traditional term, but I think when American companies that have their bases in Silicon Valley, Facebook, Twitter, we've already mentioned a couple, now Tumblr is getting into the game, quote unquote, they are, when this sort of started, were very clearly branded and associated in part because of their, close collaboration with you and Jared Cohen and other people, as American. Mm-hmm. And now we've just recently seen Twitter decide to comply, if you will, with certain more constrictive, restrictive national policies in other countries. While the Twitter leadership is now running around and explaining what they really mean by that decision, I wonder what your take on that is, and whether that is a conscious move by quote-unquote American media companies to not be seen elsewhere as agents of, American foreign policy.
Yeah, no, I think that their motivation is exclusively in their becoming a global business. So, for example, in Germany, right? I was with Jack Dorsey last week in Germany, and I know that they want to build a business in Germany. In order for them to build a business in Germany, they have to comply with local laws, one of which is you can't publish anything about Nazism. And so they are now doing the exact same thing that Facebook and Google have done. They've done the exact same thing that any media company of any scale has done, which is complying with local laws. The thing that they're doing, I understand, and I haven't dug into this too deeply, is that they're being very transparent about what's being censored, and that actual example of censorship is then being published. So I think that they're bending over backwards to try to be the very best internet freedom actor that they can be without breaking the law in dozens of countries around the world, and thereby, throttling back their business interests.
So I wonder about, there's still, interestingly, because of censorship, there are these sort of black spots on the globe if you will, with respect to reach of social media. And there, American foreign policy, or arguably the international community, has to be smarter, even smarter, about just charging these tools in combination with other things. So, other tools in the foreign policy toolkit. So, in thinking about a combination of digital diplomacy, if you will, and other parts of potentially traditional diplomacy, what levers are you thinking about in concert to sort of aid these kind of youth and revolt movements?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing I would say is that with our internet freedom agenda, it's not really about aiding revolts. It really is about helping people exercise their universal rights. We have the same internet freedom agenda in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, two allies of ours, that we do in Iran and Syria, two companies that are not our allies. And our allies don't necessarily like that, but it does have the virtue of consistency, and it has the virtue of being true. And so one of the nice things about it is that since we aren't focused on regime change, we can focus on this fairly agnostic to place. So I thought it was important to make that point. In terms of what we can do to help people exercise their universal rights in places that are not yet saturated with the internet, well, this just goes back to sort of the old building blocks of statecraft and of our democracy and human rights programming. I think it's important to not lead with technology. Technology itself is just a tool. And, I think it would be naive and foolish to think that we should be flipping diplomacy into digital diplomacy. This is just one more tool in the pretty big toolbox for diplomats. I think that's an important tool. That's an important point. And then lastly, a lot of the attention given to this topic is given, not surprisingly, to conflict environments, to environments in which revolutions or other dissent movements are taking place. But at the end of the day, I think that these things can actually be of greatest consequence as tools of development. So it's interesting. Internet industries make up between 3.5 and 6% of GDP in most developed countries, but they make up about 21% of GDP growth over the last 5 years. Countries that are becoming newly networked in South Central Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and such places, for me, the opportunity there really goes to economic development and the growing of their working classes and middle classes within these countries. So as excited as people have been over the last year on the topic of, quote, tech for revolution, I think that longer term technology for development and fostering upward economic mobility actually will be of greater consequence, if not of greater headlines.
Which is fantastic because that neatly brings me to my last point. It's like we briefed this interview. So, of course, we follow your tweets, Alec. So,
good.
Davos.
At Alec J. Ross. You should follow me.
Menstruating cows.
Yes.
Last question. Why did you talk about menstruating cows at Davos?
Because first of all, I think in a room full of 500 people, it's important to make sure everybody's awake halfway through. Now, in all seriousness, Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google, was talking about mobile phones as a platform for economic development. And I said that's a perfect segue to menstruating cows. And specifically, there's this terrific thing that the State Department supported called the Apps for Africa contest, where in essence what we did is we mapped the needs of people on the ground in East African countries with this community of apps developers who are there. And we built a contest around it, and the winner was this thing called iCow, which is a tool that's now being used by a ton of dairy farmers throughout sub-Saharan Africa that essentially allows people to become more efficient cattle herders and dairy farmers. And it does everything from map menstrual cycles so that they can maximize breeding, to know when to do milking, to connecting to prices at different markets for their goods. It's fascinating.
Have you had a chance to test this out?
I have not. I would fail as a farmer, I think. But no, it just goes to show that the reach of these tools can be anywhere. And, as I said in Davos last week, nobody in Washington, nobody in Davos would ever have thought of the need for a tool to help map menstrual cycles of dairy cows in sub-Saharan Africa. But I'll be darned if it didn't happen and if it hasn't become a huge success.
Thank you, Alec, for being so generous with your time for the project.